Whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, I hope you're having a good day. All three of our lessons touch on the subject of who is in and who is out. Our Old Testament lesson comes from Isaiah chapter 56, where we see God flipping things upside down, bringing outcasts into the fold many centuries ago. Even so today, God's embrace is far wider than many Christians tend to imagine. At the end of verse 7 we read, "For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." Have we at St. John's drawn a line for who is in and who is out? Taking a deeper look at our text, the foreigners that God is speaking of are Gentiles and eunuchs, two groups that were looked upon by the Jews with great distaste. But these individuals have a desire to be included among the people of God. They keep the Sabbath and refrain from doing evil. Interestingly, in Deuteronomy forbids the admission of eunuchs. These verses show God breaking down established barriers and allowing access to himself. Of course, these are only two groups of outcasts. In verse 8, you'll read, "Who gathers the outcasts of Israel? I will gather others." Some others at that time would be lepers and Jewish women. Today, who might those outcasts be? This text fits well with today's gospel message, where we see Jesus challenge established boundaries which some would consider just and righteous. Our second reading is from Romans 11. Chapter 11 is a continuation of verses 9 and 10, where the question of Israel's unfaithfulness is raised and whether God's frustration with them has caused him to abandon them. Paul emphatically says, never. In this chapter, we also learn that God intends salvation for all, not just Israel, similar to what we read in our Old Testament lesson. In verse 29, Paul tells us that God does not go back on his word. And verses 30 through 32 present the idea that because of Israel's disobedience, God turned his mercy to the Gentiles, who became beneficiaries of Israel's disobedience, and hopefully Israel's jealousy of the Gentiles will lead them to become faithful to God, kind of a tick for tack. I think the final verse is about tough love, God's tough love. He allows us to suffer the consequences of our disobedience so that we might be motivated to change our ways, to turn to Christ, that he might have mercy on all. Our gospel lesson in Matthew starts with Jesus challenging the boundaries used by the scribes and Pharisees as to what is clean and unclean. Jesus declares that what comes out of the mouth is based on the heart, and what comes out of the heart determines what makes one clean. Perhaps those slips of the tongue are how we truly feel. The saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," is not true. It's a lie. Verbiage can be very hurtful and harmful. And of course, it's not just verbiage. We read in verse 19, quoting Jesus, "For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person." So, from the heart come thoughts, feelings, and motives, which could be kind or destructive. Verses 21 through 28 have Jesus going into a foreign land where he encounters a Canaanite woman who would be considered unclean, an outsider, because she is a foreigner and a woman, a double negative. But she understands who Jesus is, calling him Lord, Son of David. Her understanding of who Jesus is better than that of the disciples. Though the Canaanite woman would be considered unclean, what comes out of her mouth is faith and reverence. Her heart is clean. Her actions demonstrate her recognition of Jesus' power and authority. More importantly, she understands that Jesus is hope for the whole world. In the end, we have Jesus once again removing, or at least redefining, boundaries and calling into question the definitions of clean and unclean. In all three lessons, we see God being more and more inclusive. God intends salvation for all, not just Israel. Are we ready to follow a God who is constantly entering new territory and breaking boundaries, meeting outsiders, and granting them not just a crumb, but a place at the table? In closing, I want to share with you some words from Pastor Jim Dant, a Baptist pastor. And just briefly, a close reading of both the Old and New Testaments reveals an ongoing broadening of the faith. God's people are constantly moving toward expansive grace and broad inclusion. Since the days of old, there has been an evolution of grace. Be blessed.